Mhm. No, we started. So hello everybody. Today here, Fanny Anzai interviews. I'm Fanny Anzai, your host, and today we have the pleasure and honor of receiving Daniella Mestyanek Young, writer of Uncultured. Let me show you guys this beautiful, amazing book here. Thank you so much for coming, Daniela.
Thank you for
And
having me.
we just met like a few minutes ago before I started recording, and we brought her here to have a conversation about this fantastic memoir, a survivor and a freedom seeker fighter. uh, I don't know, can you introduce yourself in better for people, whatever I forgot to say? Of course, we're going to talk about your career and everything.
Yeah, of course. So I am Daniella. I grew up in mostly Brazil, where you are, but in a religious cult called the Children of God. And actually, I'm a third generation survivor of that cult. My mom was also born and raised in it. My grandparents were the ones that joined. When I was about 15, I got myself kicked out and excommunicated, and we can talk about that. And I came to the US, and I'd always been an American, but I'd never been really in the US. And I had to go to school, high school for the first time, go to college. And then I ended up deciding to commission into the US Army during war. I became an intelligence officer, and I was one of the first women that got to be on the ground combat teams with the men, which was the beginning of sort of desegregating the U.S. Army by gender. And then I got out of the Army and got married and had a baby and worked and became a speaker. And then I was watching all of this stuff going on in the country and all of this politics and all of this social confusion, and which, by the way, is the time that cults pop up, right? When things start changing a lot and everything gets loud and confusing. And I was like, I want to write a book about this. And so, enter Uncultured, which is not your typical military story or even survivor story, because I'm actually making some parallels here. So I'll tell you, Uncultured starts with a prologue where I am at Army basic training. I'm 22 years old. I'm holding this really heavy duffel bag over my head, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, I just joined another cult.
It is, I got shivers just of you reproducing, giving your short of the prologue. It is an amazing book. I feel like because of my pregnancy, like just like when we're in our period, more sensitive, and I have been crying throughout the book, even in some happy moments, because it's so human, it's so intense. It's of course there is all the gross stuff that they have done, those cults, and was interesting because I never really knew much about the children of God specifically. And when I mentioned to my husband I was reading and who I was about to interview, he's like, oh, but you have not watched all the Rose McGowan and all the other survivors. And then I watched some stuff and I was horrified. Like it's dealing with the gross part of humanity, and you have come out through, broke out of it, which I guess is such a difficult thing to happen when it happens in early age, childhood, indoctrination of this type, and the abuse, and to even manage to make the people believe that the systemites would be worse, and that what keep that the hostage situation uh, in so many ways. And you went through all that in the beginning of the book. As I was crying, I was so impressed the way that you bring this up, bring this to us in such a cheerful way. The way that you like, oh, did that make sense? But if the adults already know, it's just I'm a kid, I don't know, there is something to be that I will find out later. So it goes through a lot of the psychology of the cults. It's deep, it's intense, it's amazing. I'm really really happy to have encountered you on Audible first, and then I had to get the book to have this physical approach to it, and it's was very interesting because you grew up in Brazil, you bring places, Petropolis and Rio, where I graduated. I studied medicine in the medicine school faculty in Petropolis, and the description of being so secluded from everybody around, not just by the walls, but by the language too, and the way that the cult managed to keep you guys hostage and secret and running from place to place at the same time as making you guys believe that the systemites were the bad people persecuting and kind of reinforcing all the teachings, the cult teachings, but in a horrible way. It was almost like a criminal mafia just disguised as a religious cult.
Yeah, and what's interesting about cults is cults are always about labor. And so the Children of God really was. It was 10,000 people around the world, and it was largely a child trafficking organization. And, a part of what they did to us was keep us geographically displaced, right? So I was born in the Philippines, where you don't get citizenship for being born. And then I lived in Japan, I lived in Peru, lived in Brazil. And, to the point of what you were saying, I lived in Brazil for 6 years before I learned how to speak Portuguese. So it wasn't until I was 10 years old and we moved to Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte, and we lived with another family and in our commune, but they were all Brazilian. And she was actually a big translator for the cult. And she kind of made sure that we learned Portuguese. And I remember very specifically at 10 years old realizing, like, yes, somebody's going to teach me the language of the country I'm in. And that makes me safer, right? And that gives me this like if I ever need to run away, I can,
Yeah.
right? And of course, the other thing I think is funny, like so much part of, evangelicalism in general, but definitely these closed off groups is, going out to try to witness to people, and the constant rejection that you get reinforces this idea that like the outside people are bad. But like Brazilians are the friendliest people on the planet. So it's, I never absorbed this idea that like Brazilians were mean and evil, because it's so friendly. It's such a beautiful country. I really appreciate that even though I grew up in this pretty horrific childhood, like I got to experience this other culture that is warm and beautiful, and I still have relationships down there. My we had an exchange student come live with us, me and my husband, from Brazil, and she's actually studying medicine now in uh,
It's really
in
nice.
Recife.
Oh, that's amazing. So, can you tell? I usually don't ask people to spoil in any way whatsoever the book, but your book has so many amazing stories. Is there anything specific you would be like not spoiler to tell us about the your life and the book itself? You know, uh, I guess I'll keep something for the Portuguese because we said we're gonna speak in Portuguese a little bit in the end. So for the Brazilians that are, English practicing now, ESL, English second language, want to read something amazing, check out her book, Uncultured. And it will bring you a little bit of Brazilian taste too. She talks about the smells and the nature, the environment, and the foods. You end up being a natural cook, huh? In your books. But in Portuguese, which I think I would not, I probably didn't make any notes, but we're probably going to speak about this in Portuguese in the end. Is that in Portuguese in Brazil, the culture, it's common to say that you're gonna wash the kid's mouth with soap, but it was actually a one of the torturing practices of torture that they had in the cult in different levels of, as what you would say, uh, sadistic, different uncles. Huh?
Yeah, so they had a very strong belief in, there's this Bible verse that says, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, which is the name of the first chapter in Uncultured. And, our prophet believed in like very, very harsh discipline of children and very much like controlled, So I say that growing up, it's easy to focus on kind of like the sexual abuse that you hear about with children of God, but it was also, extreme physical abuse. And then on top of that, a lot of psychological stuff, right? Like they used isolation, they used what they called silence restriction, where you just couldn't speak to anyone for days on end sometimes. And yes, the mouth washing out with soap, which I mean, this was even 100 years ago in America, this was a popular punishment to use, especially in sort of evangelical Christian households, very much to use that. And, I was this little kid that was very, very, smart, questioning, and I really like logic even to this day. And so, the part I can talk about is like I'm going through this world, and we tell it all in story. I think it's a pretty vivid story. It's a pretty good page turner, but it takes you through, right? Like one chapter is kind of about the discipline. One chapter is about the medical neglect and kind of goes on through, like you said, really, exploring the psychology, which is what I've been doing, is studying group psychology while I was writing this book. And so it takes you through that from the eyes of a child who was kind of like in this cult, but was always on the outside, right? Because I was always a little bit different, thinking, questioning, trying to figure things out. And, this is a very good parallel for the military side of the book, which is like in these groups that are these high demand, high control groups, which of course cults are, of course armies are, but many other kinds of groups can be high control, high demand. And it always comes down to like the number one rule is don't stand out, right? Like no individual should ever be more important than the group. And so, of course, as a child, when you're growing up in that, that means you're sublimating sort of everything about figuring out your personality and, just asking questions, right? All of these things that children do. And so, I think in Uncultured, you see kind of like the process of how they break people down, but then also like how we as children like needed to go into our heads and think of the outside world to survive, right? So if this makes sense.
It's amazing because one of my topics was exactly how the cults, the brainwash, the indoctrination, it's all a fight that they want to put in people's mind, that collectivism is something over individualism, and it's the same thing. The individual is not important, or the individual has to be something so common, so the same as the others, that is that easy to manage, or there's no management required. So
Right.
the people become pieces of puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And I think so. The interesting thing about like brainwashing, right, is which I just like to call it programming, because the idea of brainwashing that was born in 1960s and 1970s was that you could just kind of take someone and do stuff to them like magic. And of course, that has been debunked. That is not true. And what happens with brainwashing with adults is that the adults buy into it, right? So there's a big part of cults that use this thing called thought stopping cliches, right? Like trust the plan or Jesus is the answer, all of these things. Boys will be boys. These are thought stopping cliches. And adults, they don't realize it, but they are going along with their own programming. Children don't go along with their own programming, right? So when children are born into these groups, of course we're impacted, of course we're traumatized. There's all these things about our development that get like very mixed up. But I feel like the brainwashing, the control, and the programming, it quite work on children the way that it works on adults. And so I think, we would sort of break up into two different groups, like the ones that were always trouble and the ones that would go along to get along. And that was like, my mom was always one of those. She grew up in this. She had 7 babies in 14 years. She was the perfect follower of God's army. And in Uncultured, I really kind of grapple with like, I'm the unbeliever and she's the true believer. But in actuality, she eventually leaves the cult too. Like, it turns out she was always questioning things too, right? And so I don't really think that you can achieve kind of perfect brainwashing and control on children in the same way that you do with grown-ups. And I think that that becomes our saving grace. And that's what got most of us out there once we grew up.
Yeah, it's quite impressive. It's something I wondered throughout the book when you read the ineptitude of so many adults, and even when the cult tried to reform itself, uh, it didn't really happen because they were the, let's say, the bad apples. But you mentioned in the end that no, the entire tree is rotten because it's horrible. The principles were wrong. They were wrong all the time. And it takes something that probably, like you said, it came from your mom, something genetic, that would be this questioning, because so many people are going to just, or maybe the majority would fall for it. Not this necessary cult, but different cults. People are seeking cults. They quit a cult, but they need to find another group. I think it's a need of community that humans have, but people cannot rationalize that and make a healthy place for us to share our difference. Ends up
Mm-hmm.
a little communistic in the way that we need to make everybody the same.
Yes. And, this is exactly, so when I set out to write Uncultured and I pulled in a writing partner to help me, make it awesome. And she said, she looked at like all of these stories that I wanted to talk about. And she said, all right, look, a memoir is not about you. It's about one idea. What's the idea? And I was like, oh, that's easy. There's this group psychology concept that I have been studying for a very long time that essentially says that human beings will do almost anything to fit in with their groups that they've voluntarily joined. Right. And I was like, oh, I can show you that. Right. I can show you this in a cult. I can show you this in the military. And what you said about the seekers, right? That's the one thing that scholars have found that make you likely to join a cult is you're seeking something, right? People are looking for a group that's going to change their life. They're looking for a purpose that's going to drive them. They're looking for a strong community. And then what happens is they get isolated. And then if the logic breaks down, the logic doesn't always break down, then you just have like a strong group. But if the logic breaks down, you don't notice. And the thing that's so powerful about children of God is, everybody thinks it wouldn't be them. And everybody definitely thinks that when their prophet starts encouraging pedophilia, they would walk away, right? But 10,000 people didn't walk away. Like 5,000 of us were in Brazil, I think. Um,
Yeah.
hugely Brazil-based cult. And, and it's, even when I started telling these stories, people would say to me, oh, well, the cult, well, that's obviously evil. And it's just like, no, it's not. If you're there, it's not obvious, right? And in every culture, things that seem weird from the outside make sense if you go to where they came from. And then people would say, oh, but the US Army, that's a wonderful organization. which again is funny. And like, this is kind of how Americans think, right? Like, we worship our military. But again, I have this background in South America and all of these friends that constantly are like, it's so weird how y'all worship your military, you know? Like, we in Brazil have like a healthy fear of our military and respect, but it's not this sort of deification. And the way I break it down is like, well, the US Army is 1.3 million people trained to kill other human beings, right? Like, that is what we are. We are trained killers, trained to conduct violence on behalf of state. And so if we just look at this as a wonderful organization, right, this is why we have these same cultural problems that we have in the cult, right? Because the children of God, they tried super hard to rebrand. They changed to the family, they repudiated the sexual practices, but they never went back and actually like said the prophet was wrong, right? They never dug into their values to see, why are so many pedophiles attracted to this? And so, of course, they were not able to fix it. They just kind of went from a sex cult into a child trafficking organization. And of course, the pedophiles kept doing awful things to the children, just in secret. And this is, you know, a very similar thing we have in the military, where it's like the military, US Army loves to talk about their values, but they don't really look at like, well, why, you know, why are so many rapists attracted to the US Army? Why, you know, when we see these stories in Uncultured of Daniella going out on these patrols with 25 guys, she's the only woman, she's making history, but she has to be pulled aside and warned to watch her back against 25 American soldiers, right? Why do we think that? That's the rape culture. And that's, you know, what we're really trying to show here in this book, is that like, these things happen, these cultures are built because of these certain things. And until we're willing to kind of go into it and really get real about what the actual values in our culture, what is the reporting, what are the laws, you know, that's what is going to show us where toxic control comes from. And I'm sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, it was great. I love you bring up a good umbrella of a perspective of it. And um, the practices with the, guess with the Berg's death, they changed, they brought new, like it just became, it's not accepted systemic anymore as was before, but it's still happening. All the sexual abuse and misconducts in different levels, even the the punishment, it's not it would depend a lot of which uncle would be conducting. So uh, how you think it's possible to today, if not the children of God, but other cults and other groups, is there any way that we can actually help these people and police groups that are secluded and isolated this way? Do you even know? Are not they like clandestines and like we are right, almost like
It's
trying to find them?
it's really hard, right? It's really hard. So 4 countries tried: Argentina, the UK, Australia, and I'm missing on the third. And also Japan kicked them out. So like, countries have tried, but you know, one of the issues here is that our modern, like, Western cultures, which then of course influence much of the world, is built on the concept of religious freedom, right? And then secondly, like, we were trained to lie. And there's actually, for those who are interested in a sample, there's a chapter of my book published in Rolling Stone magazine. So if you just Google Rolling Stone magazine, Daniella Mestyanek Young, you'll find it. And the chapter is after this raid has gone down on the cult in Argentina, and the children have been taken away and the adults have been hauled off to jail. And this chapter is us in Brazil being woken up in the middle of the night to do like literally a what I learned later is like a U.S. Army battle drill, right? Practice of what would happen if it happened in our homes. And we had doctrines called deceivers yet true, where we were trained, again, because you all are the systemites, you're evil. We have an us versus them culture in a cult, and we also have an ends justifies the means culture, right? So whatever we have to do, any lie that we have to tell to the bad guys to save the good guys, it's worth it, right? So as children, when you took us from the compounds, we would be working against our own benefit. And I think I have a line in Uncultured that, I was almost as afraid to go as I was to stay, right? Because of course I knew my world was miserable and awful, but I was told that this was love, this was family, this was home, and the outside world was really, truly terrible. And, the sad part is that's what takes us, I think, the longest to unlearn and to recover from, is this sort of fear of the outside world and this fear of persecution that we are taught to grow up with. But to go back to answering your question,
Yeah.
it is really hard for, I think, individuals in societies to help to even draw flags, just because there's so much freedom, and groups that want to like exercise toxic control are pretty good at it, and evidence is the Children of God operated for 50 years and is still operating, very much smaller, but they have not been successfully destroyed, even though they're very, very notorious for doing terrible things to children.
Exactly. Yeah, I was about to ask because I checked online, and it seems that they still operate in the present day.
Yeah, my grandfather still runs the money.
Yeah, it's very impressive. Do they still do the flirty fishing techniques too, or probably not?
No, and that was a really old practice, right? So this was mostly in the 70s, and as soon as AIDS became a thing, that completely flipped and they just went insular. But he did use, the prophet used what they called flirty fishing, which is from this Bible verse in Matthew where Jesus says, I will make you fishers of men. And so they literally called themselves, hookers for Christ. And it was this, he essentially turned like all of his female followers into prostitutes, and everyone was expected to go out and have sex with men to either lure them into the cult or to bring in money. And that, that ended before I was born, but it's definitely like a legacy that we all grew up with, right? And that like part of how much notoriety and disapproval they got from using religious prostitution and from, of course, openly sort of encouraging pedophilia was why they then went and rebranded. And, in the 80s, they got into childhood entertainment videos and, educational videos. And this is what I grew up most of my life doing, was being a child actress on these videos, singing, dancing, and then we would also then go sell them on the streets all over the world.
Yeah, it's it was impressive to read and go through it and realize that it works just as a criminal mafia group, making the kids beg, do all this work, hard work, keep them away from a proper education. Uh, it's a way to slave, I guess, to keep them away from knowledge and to be able to think by themselves, for sure. So it's an impressive story, and I'm really impressed the way that you wrote so nicely. I couldn't let it go. The book was trying to speed read it throughout the. I just got on the weekend, but it was just a pleasure. No uh, effort to read, because your writing is just amazing,
Yeah.
and even with such horrible stories that definitely made me cry, I was impressed. It brings to us this human resilience, which we've seen showing up when it's more necessary, I guess. Your techniques of taking your mind out of the moment and being able to go through all that, and then writing all these horrible stories in such a way that makes us cry, but empathize and not really horrify us so much as the reality really.
Yeah.
Um,
And I will say I had amazing help writing this book, and as a commercial, I guess, right? So it was me and two fiction authors that were helping me write this book. And I feel like in a way it was translating, right, from my group experience into good language that everyone can understand. And we worked really hard to make it a page turner, right? And this book has everything. This book has, like love and death and war and cults and murder, suicide and abuse, but also
yeah,
awesome stuff and, winning marathons and all kinds of things. But a big thing when we were trying to sell the book was, publishers would say, well, we don't do children of God stories because the abuse is too horrible. Or we don't do stories about military women because they don't sell in the US. And I was like looking at these parallels and I was like, oh, when you ask like what can society do, right? And it's like, well, society doesn't know. Society doesn't know how awful it was inside this group because nobody has put it on the page in this way because it's kind of assumed that the reader can't tolerate it. And
yeah,
then by the same token, right, everyone in America thinks they know what it's like for women in the military. What happens to the daughters of America when we disappear behind these high commune walls of the Department of Defense, and like they don't know. So I do think, it's a very intense book, but
it
it's
is.
kind of fun to read. And we wrote it like that on purpose, right? Like we worked really hard that while we're
Make
bringing
it
you into these
relatable.
very heavy topics, we're still protecting you and you can still see like why we're telling these stories because everything is linked to this journey that you're going to go through. And part of the point of this book is that most normal people have never thought a lot about the parallels between a sex cult that traffics children and the beloved US Army. And then once you see these parallels so vividly in the writing, like you're now invited to question all the groups that you have been in your life. And I say, if everyone that reads the books just walks into their next group experience and just says, is this a cult? Like you'll be that much
Either
closer,
way.
right? To identifying the toxic group behavior. And if you can't laugh when you ask yourself if it's a cult, then that's your first sign.
That's right. And I'm impressed because with I think the transition of being born in the cult, which is forced to join the military, maybe is what glorifies or what gives us this, you said, kind of a deification of army in US, but I guess it's more to the individuals that give themselves to that work because we know
Yeah.
that might be at least a minimum abuse, psychological abuse that we all hear. The culture, the common culture, maybe we don't know the deep, dark secrets of what happens there,
Mhm.
but we all fear, yeah, if you become a soldier, it's harder than your first day in school, even if it's a really
Right.
bad day. And I think that's why we might have so much respect, at least for the
Yeah.
people that go through the
Yeah.
army and any type of other naval.
Yeah. And one of the things about what you're saying is that like going through hard things with a team is very bonding, right? And so, you know, people will say to me, like, oh, it's surprising that after you left this cult, you joined the military. And actually, it's not that surprising, right? Most people that have one cultic experience have a
Yeah,
second one. And I say, like, this is because cults do some things right and they give you this sense of clarity, right? This sense of identity, this mission, this purpose, and I think so importantly, community. And, I feel very much like I have 5,000 brothers and sisters. I only have 25, but I have 5,000 other kids that like went through this same crucible that I went through growing up. And so we bond. And, I always say, like, if you doubt this, just ask any veteran of the US military to tell you some of their stories. And they will tell you, like, horror story, horror story, horror story, and then say, but I miss it and I made the best friends of my life. Right. And I think that's one of the things, right, is like when you have been in a cult or any kind of high control, high demand group, and you've experienced that sense of community, like you yearn for it, you want it again. Right. And it's very wonderful for humans to be surrounded with people that like believe the same thing you believe and think just like you and are constantly reinforcing that you're doing the right thing. So actually for like a lot of people in their cults, right, it becomes this almost enjoyable experience because of the community and because of the way that feels. And that can be one of the things that's like, once you know that, like I always like to tell Army veterans for this, because we tend to really struggle with suicidal ideology when we leave the military. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter if you're leaving a relationship, you're leaving a military, you're leaving a church. There's going to be a blank space where that sense of community was before. And so you need to try to fill that blank space with something healthy. Otherwise, just another toxic group is going to be what comes up and gives you that sense of community.
Totally agreed. And maybe that is the difficulty of humans to let it go of cults, as you mentioned, to feel that you're going to be alone. If you tell through your story when you're leaving that did I commit the biggest mistake of my life living? Even if you were convinced for years and you were so certain that everything that happened there was wrong, you still had that fear. And of course, there is always a hard adaptation in the next
Yeah.
level when you came to the system, or the adaptation to even realize maybe I will never fit. But I think that is a common thought, and that's why I think it's so human, so intense. Your book is so, like you said, it's takes us as our humanity, because we all feel like that at some point in life, that we don't fit, that we're not from here, that we're not belong
Yeah.
to this planet, for not thinking the same. And I think is the mistake is to, when you join a cult independent, even if it's voluntarily joined, it should not be something that will replace your individuality. And that is the uncomfortable part that we have, that we want to be part of a group, we feel uncomfortable to be different or to stand out in the group. But
Yeah.
that is definitely it might be the thing that made you so special, to be able to break out of the group and seek for freedom, and even join our other cult, like you said, but a much more gratifying experience
Yeah.
than the army, for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things I think people can look out for when they are in these groups that are high demand and they're wondering if it might be toxic or turn toxic is exactly what you said. Was is like, how much are they asking you to sacrifice yourself for this group or give up something about yourself in order to fit in versus like what are you getting in return? Right. And the other thing to
Yeah.
look out for is isolation. But like really like are they asking and asking and asking and there's this higher mission and you're constantly sacrificing. This is why nonprofits can turn into cults very easily, right? So it's that thing. But I definitely had this experience. Like, yes, I left when I was 15 and I never once questioned that I made the right choice. But I spent 6, 7 years being very, very, very lonely. And it did, drive me into a toxic relationship. And it did then drive me into the military. And always figuring out like I don't fit, right? I had this thought in high school like, oh, I'm not from Brazil, I'm from a different planet, and I really can't go anywhere in the world where I'm from. And so that always made me feel like, oh, I'm so different. And one of my turning points personally, and it's in the book, and somebody tells me, you know, get over yourself. You're not as different as you think you are. And I think like that is such an amazing message for trauma survivors. And, you know, it was so, I'll show you my pin here.
Oh,
You
that's
know,
nice.
the
Very
two
important.
flags, Brazil and America. And what was so beautiful about writing this book is like it was always so complicated to explain who I am or where I'm from, or like put, you know, I didn't get to develop my personal identity when I was a kid. So I've been having to do it now alongside my, you know, 1 to 6 year old. And now that I've written this book, like I just get to be me, you know, like I'm from America, I'm from Brazil. Like I, you know, I wasn't born there, but I was raised there. It makes up a piece of my heart. And, you know, I've found a way to kind of be comfortable and live with, I call it culturally confused, you know, all these just different things about me. And
You are
I
a
even raised my daughter in Portuguese
multicultural
for 5
person.
years.
The real multicultural individual, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. E
Because
você queria falar português, não é?
exactly. So we're gonna change to Portuguese, but just to finish, you speak 3 languages, that's right? Portuguese, English, and Spanish. And lived in what, 10 different countries in total, probably? Or
Yeah, I think it's 9 or 10. And of
okay.
course, I've traveled a lot.
And you didn't publish your book in Portuguese yet. So Brazilians and English speakers, go check. It's still just in English, but of course for the second language speakers will enjoy too. And you need to find a way to translate them though for
Yeah,
Portuguese.
yeah. Hopefully, you know, if it sells good in the US, then other countries will be interested to come get translation deals.
That is really nice. You can do it yourself. You speak good Portuguese, and that's what we speak Portuguese.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean,
let's.
fortunately, I'm not going to say unfortunately, but fortunately, the publishing house owns this book. So they get to make the decision on when the translation comes. But I do hope that I'll be able to travel Brazil at some point and give like book talks in Portuguese once it gets translated. That'll be very fun.
Sounds amazing. I hope you do it for sure. Yeah, I don't live in Brazil. I live in Canada, but yeah, and with all this COVID times, I have not been there since 2019 before the lockdown started. But yeah, Brazil, it's amazing, and you still experience all the weather and the environment, the trees, the green around the communes. So I hope you can go and enjoy Brazil fully, freedom, going to places and choosing where to go. And
Oh,
so
yes.
in English, I'll finish here in English. We're going to speak a little bit in Portuguese. Go check out them culture. Okay, Amazon Audible. I have both, and I loved it. And it's you guys gonna have it's a delight. This book, it's amazing. So let's change for Portuguese. Vamos falar um pouquinho em português só para dar um gosto para o pessoal, os leitores. Eu tenho alguns amigos escritores e leitores em português brasileiros que gostam de ler em inglês, então aí vai a dica para comprar o seu Uncultured. Ainda não tem a versão em português, mas vamos ver, né? É o que a gente estava falando. Trabalhar aí, é o próximo projeto, é a tradução e quem sabe fazer palestra aí no Brasil, né?
Eu já fiz uma palestra no Brasil, então, como você estava falando, eu fui em o ano 2020, no janeiro, então, bem antes do Covid. E eu fui com minha família para lá, para visitar, passamos no Rio e no Belo Horizonte, os lugares onde eu estava como criança. E eu teve essa oportunidade de como ver minha filha brincando na praia de Copacabana, onde o livro começa quando eu estou lá vendo a praia do Brasil, mas não livre. E daí eu levei minha família para Recife, onde a gente teve um aluno de intercâmbio que veio morar com a gente nos Estados Unidos e agora é como nossa filha. E, assim, alugamos um carro, viajamos todo o Nordeste do Brasil. E eu falo um pouquinho no fim do livro que foi, assim, tão lindo para como eu cresci lá e eu tenho, assim, o sabor da cultura, mas com memórias cheias de dor. Mas daí eu teve a oportunidade de passar já um mês no Brasil, assim, fazendo memórias super lindas, assim, uma cultura que eu adoro, que uma família que agora é como nossa família adotada no Brasil.
Que lindo. Muito satisfeita. Acho que faltou eu falar essa parte no inglês. O pessoal vai ficar com aquela dúvida, né? Ah, então ela ainda vai para o Brasil e você já foi. Mas, é, mas uma parte aqui que eu queria falar. Então, pessoal, a gente fez a entrevista toda no inglês e talvez ficou faltando aí uma certa introdução no português. Essa aqui é a Daniella Mestyanek Young, que escreveu esse livro maravilhoso, On Culture, que é uma memória, né, da história, da jornada dela, de sair de um culto e entrar voluntariamente no exército, que seria um segundo culto que ela realiza durante a jornada dela. Então, e o que eu só queria dar essa introdução para vocês, porque a gente falou bem pouquinho, a gente deixou pouco tempo para falar em português, mas uma das coisas que ela traz muito no livro, nas experiências dela, estando em Petrópolis e em Belo Horizonte, que são coincidências da nossa brasilidade, né, de sermos conterrâneas nesse sentido, de eu sou mineira e estudei em Petrópolis, então eu me senti muito assim empatizada por algumas coisas que você traz da cultura brasileira, dos cheiros, da vegetação. E uma coisa interessante era que no culto, entre vários tipos de abusos, eles faziam mesmo o que o brasileiro só fala, né, da boca para fora, que vou lavar a boca desse menino com sabão, e entre outros abusos. Você pode falar um pouquinho para o pessoal em português, né, dessa sua trajetória aí de vida, e para convidar eles a lerem a história, que é sensacional. É uma história muito humana e maravilhosa, escrita de uma forma super prazerosa de ler.
Para mim falar um
Yeah.
pouquinho do livro, ok. Sim, então eu nasci nesse, eu acho que chama de seita, culto ou seita, que se chama em português Meninos de Deus. E era a ideia de ser todo sobre amor e Jesus, e virou a ser muito tóxico. E eles usavam prostituição, abusos sexuais com crianças e tudo era para preparar para o fim do mundo, né? Quando Jesus vai voltar. E então eu cresci em essa seita no Brasil, todo isolado. Por sorte, eu comecei a aprender português com 10 anos e eu comecei a sentir mais conectado com o país. Daí movemos de novo, e então com 15 anos eu me escapei desse grupo e eu fui no ensino médio, eu atendi a universidade, e daí eu acho que eu estava realmente sentindo falta de um grupo, né, de uma comunidade, assim, não esse horrível, mas eu queria me encaixar em um outro lugar. E então eu entrei no exército americano e eu fui ter toda uma experiência diferente. Eu fui na guerra, mas também tinha umas similaridades de como as pessoas ficam agindo dentro de um grupo. Então o livro realmente é uma história bem fascinante, mas também é a ideia do como os grupos developam e como
Se desenvolve.
controlam as pessoas, né? Desenvolvem, sim, e podem controlar as pessoas de uma maneira tóxica, e tem diferentes coisas que queremos sempre estar olhando, enfrentando quando interagimos com grupos.
É uma história sensacional, porque a Daniela é uma sobrevivente e uma lutadora de, né, a busca da liberdade dela e com toda a, né, o raciocínio, chegar a essas conclusões e conseguir ficar livre finalmente para ter para alcançar a liberdade, aquela individualidade, né?
Sim, sim.
Que é muito, como diz, reduzida quando se fala dos cultos, das seitas, as seitas religiosas,
Sim.
alguns, né, no Brasil é muito comum, pequenas seitas, então cabia muito bem a história e a
Sim,
crianças de Deus
sim.
lá, debaixo daquela, né, daquele guarda-chuva que eles falam que é da liberdade religiosa que existe. Então, eles abusavam em diferentes, né, psicológica, física, sexualmente, de crianças, né, com isso nas escrituras deles mesmo. E uma coisa que só é possível porque a gente ainda tem muito desses grupos, dessas seitas, pela lavagem, né? Um programming que você falou, como se fala, lavagem cerebral que acontece, porque fala para a família que a família em si, o pai, a mãe, esses laços, que são os laços que a gente, biológicos, né? E evidência que a gente tem de algum tipo de sentimento que seria incondicional, que isso não é tão importante quanto o amor a Deus. E a gente vê
Sim,
isso em muitas seitas em diferentes níveis ainda hoje.
sim.
Tantos pais, tantos familiares ou amigos perdidos porque aquela pessoa não segue a igreja ou porque é gay e a igreja não aceita, né?
Uhum,
Então,
uhum.
a gente ainda passa por isso e tem tantos lugares no mundo, né?
Sim.
As histórias
E uma
são
dessas
diferentes.
coisas que eu vejo com essa palavra família, quando algum grupo começar a falar que é sua família, que não é sua família, assim, tem cuidado, porque
Fica atento,
geralmente
desconfie.
querem usar você para trabalhar, para pagar menos que você deveria ser pagado e para, assim, não, vamos falar, queixar ou complain, né, quando as
Não
coisas
se
não
queixar, com
são
certeza.
boas. E uma das coisas que você mencionou, eu acho que é super importante em qualquer grupo que você está, quando eles começam a tentar como amarrar sua individualidade, como restrict, né,
Retirar.
ou retirar sua individualidade, ou estão querendo que você, assim, tampar o que você é para o bom do grupo. Isso é um dos, como red flags, né? Um dos sinais
Sinais de
que
alerta.
podem ser controle tóxico.
Infelizmente, como a gente falou no inglês, esse culto ainda existe hoje em dia, reformado, provavelmente, mas a gente nunca sabe o que se passa lá dentro por ser tão recluso, tão isolado, né? O verdadeiro echo chamber, né? Que a gente
Uhum.
tem acesso e eles não têm acesso do lado de fora também. É interessante que você traz algumas coisas da cultura brasileira, como os cacos de vidro no, nos muros, né? E se questiona se é para manter os bandidos mesmo, as pessoas ruins do lado de fora, ou é para evitar que as pessoas de dentro escapem, né? Então, realmente viver num campo de concentração, uma coisa horrível,
Realmente. E
né?
uma das coisas que vê no livro é quando eu saio do Brasil, eu chego nos Estados Unidos, uma das coisas mais chocantes para mim é para ver essa casa grande com 5, 7 quartos que não tem muro grande com vidro em cima. Você pode só andar até a porta e bater na porta. E tem esse como paralelo no livro que quando os muros caiam, a gente pode ver mais para fora. Aí eu sou um adolescente, eu tô falando, olha, você me falou que os Estados Unidos é mal, mas aqui eu tô vendo, assim, pessoas vejam feliz, tratam as crianças bons, assim, a gente não pode ficar assim na rua pedindo dinheiro, porque nos Estados Unidos ninguém vai deixar isso para lá. Então, exatamente como você estava falando, era mais fácil esconder no Brasil, por diferentes causas da cultura,
E
e
que ainda
esses
existe.
muros eram esses muros tão importantes. E daí, quando eu entrei no exército, aqui eu estou, no Afeganistão, de novo, atrás desses muros, em um lugar que é super perigoso para mim. Eu começo, assim, a enfrentar todas as traumas da vida.
Eu acho interessante que é exatamente aquela coisa cultural, porque acaba perguntando, muita gente no Brasil pergunta por que o Brasil não vai para frente, né? E tem muita gente que fala ainda, né, a nova geração que quer fazer seria uma neoconservadora que fala tanto para você entrar em algum culto, para fazer parte de algum culto, mas que ao mesmo tempo a gente vê que as culturas ou os países que estão mais desenvolvidos são os países menos religiosos e ainda tem tanto, né, religioso, apologético, que ainda vai defender esses tipos de cultos, esse tipo de pensamento, essa destruição do individualismo pelo coletivismo em diferentes esferas, provavelmente ainda mais na questão política do que a espiritual, né? Então, é uma coisa que é nociva e que ainda acontece. Por exemplo, os muros, né? E as crianças pedindo esmolas, ainda é uma coisa comum no Brasil, que ainda acontece, é totalmente, né, socialmente aceitável.
Sim, sim, exatamente. E
Eu tive essa experiência dos muros quando eu cheguei aqui no Canadá e que realmente jardins maravilhosos com coisas, com mesas de piquenique, tudo montado, né? Piscina, cadeira, o pessoal deixa churrasqueira, tudo lá do lado de fora e tem uma graminha e às vezes uma cerquinha de arbusto, né? E eu falo, olha só o que que é, né? Mas o que que é a cultura e o que que é hoje em dia? Eu falo geralmente com os últimos convidados, tem falado muito sobre isso, como essa questão do tempo e espaço é uma coisa bem relativa mesmo, principalmente hoje em dia pela questão do espaço, depende muito onde você está. Você está no Brasil, você está nos Estados Unidos, no Canadá, na Europa ou no Afeganistão, no Oriente Médio, e a sensação de que você estaria no mundo passado, né?
sim,
Obsoleto,
sim,
bárbaro, em alguns desses lugares. Agora, eu vi recentemente um conhecido, outra pessoa que faz trabalho no YouTube, indo ao Afeganistão, que agora sob o controle do Talibã, e como as coisas, né? Como é uma vida miserável, como tudo é
sim.
horrível em volta e aí você vai para o Brasil, que não é tão, não é, não é, não é necessariamente como no filme Rio, né? Pessoas vivendo no meio da selva, mas
Sim,
não é tão civilizado, não é tão desenvolvido e as pessoas não são tão educadas e não tem tanta criminalidade como, né?
sim,
Não sei se tem no
sim.
Brasil,
E
aqui foi.
uma das coisas que você falou, né, do religião, porque a coisa onde religião e os cultos aceitas conectam no religião já tem esse exercício de não pensa nisso tanto, não faz sentido, você só tem que confiar com fé. Então, não é para dizer que toda religião é tóxico, mas quando alguém quer usar esse poder tóxico, controle em você, é fácil com religião, porque já tem essa coisa. E outra coisa que você falou, que talvez um bom lugar para terminar hoje é o, as primeiras ideias do livro e o título Uncultured começou porque eu estava pensando, tem muitas coisas em comum com culto e cultura, né? Cult and culture. Eu falo, não pode escrever em inglês culture without cult, né? Então eu comecei a pensar em isso, porque tantas diferentes comunidades, culturas têm ideias tão diferentes um do outro. E como é que as pessoas, assim, nessa cultura concordem em agir assim, e as pessoas entram em esse como contrato
Você faz
social,
é,
né,
e
que
você
isso
faz
vai
uma
dar, né?
e você
E
faz não só uma análise, mas uma exposição detalhada desses métodos de programação que
sim,
eles usam, porque você
sim.
viveu isso na sua vida,
E
né?
a
Isso.
Sim, e é a coisa que o culto é extremo, mas todo mundo experiência cultura, programação, essas coisas, né, nos diferentes níveis. Então, às vezes é super bom para estudar as extremas, porque daí entendemos mais sobre o que está a gente enfrentando cada dia em
Você
grupos
ainda segue
normais.
algum culto?
Sim.
Você
Eu?
ainda segue algum culto?
Sim, Taylor Swift.
Gosto de ouvir
Chamamos de Swifties. Eu tô no culto de Taylor Swift. Eu adoro todas as canções dela.
Lovely. Ok, thank you so much. Obrigada demais por essa entrevista sensacional. Pessoal, não percam esse livro aqui. É aqueles do Bucket List. Você não pode ficar sem ele, de jeito nenhum. É sensacional. Vai chorar de alegria, de tristeza, ter aquela marca para sempre. Deixa uma cicatriz, né, gente? It really scars you for life. Your book, it's amazing. I swear. I cried
It will change you.
happy,
Yes.
sad,
Yeah.
happy times, and gives you a better view of, like you said, code and culture,
And
and
culture. Yep.
parallel then well. Great
Yep.
book. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation, and guys, go check it out.
Yeah.
Please
Thank you
let
so
me
much for
know
having me.
and help you.
Yeah, please come follow me on Twitter. It's Daniella with 2 L's, M Young. And I'm very talkative on Twitter and I love, hearing from people and all of that. So
That's amazing.
thank you. Ciao.